Well, thank you, everybody. Is this working?
Yep.
It's really a pleasure to be here. As a nurse practitioner working with brain tumor patients and their families, I really know how critical the role of family caregivers is. You are the ones who communicate important information to the healthcare team about the patient. You ensure that treatments are taken as prescribed. You monitor for side effects and report them to us. You nurture patients physically and psychologically. And very importantly, you try to maintain the rhythm of ordinary life in a very extraordinary time. We all have ups and downs and challenges in our life. We have to eat, we have to rest, we have to have activities. We have to regulate our emotions so we're not overwhelmed by negative ones or falsely reassured by positive ones. There are endless practical concerns, from making dinner, buying groceries, paying bills, walking the dog, doing homework. The list goes on and on. And we have to find a sense of meaning and comfort and purpose in our lives. From time to time, we're called on to do something really hard or brand new. And we have to nourish our relationships with family members and friends. Now, if someone you love is diagnosed with a brain tumor, despite grappling with the feelings of exhaustion and shock and distress, you still have to contend with those daily challenges, no matter how mundane or formidable. And at this point, I'd like to turn the mic over to a real expert in care for the caregiver, Suzanne Heft, who can speak far more authentically than I can about what it is to live this life and how and why you must care for yourself while caring for the person you love.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? So thanks for that. So as you've heard, my name is Suzanne Heft. That's my husband, Harold, there. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about our story. We were married in 1999. We met at work, and Harold was a very charming person with a warm personality and a great sense of humor. We got married and had 2 children. I have a son, Sam, who's now 16, and another younger son, John, who's 13. Harold was a writer. He had a PhD in Canadian literature. He published books and newspaper articles, and he was a communications expert in his professional life as a senior executive in some of our finest hospitals and universities. As you heard in the introduction comments, in January of 2004, Harold collapsed at work and was rushed to emergency at St. Mike's here in Toronto. And when I found him there, he couldn't walk or talk, and he couldn't really track my eyes with his, and I immediately thought he'd had a stroke. And in fact, a scan revealed a mass on his brain, and after the biopsy, we were told he had a glioblastoma, stage 4 brain tumor, and the location of his tumor in the parietal lobe on the left side meant that surgery was considered out of the question. 3 years before, I had been diagnosed with breast cancer, which this is in 2012, and in that same year we lost Harold's father. So it was not my first rodeo having a knowledge about tumors, but this one was different, and I knew that right at the very beginning, and it was very scary. So I have been a patient receiving care, but I've also been a caregiver to someone with a brain tumor, and so I speak to you today really as a one-person story. I don't have all the answers for the questions you may have, but I have some observations and some theories, and so I thank you for listening to my story. So I just want to talk about the hardest aspects of caring for somebody with a brain tumor. I mentioned that sort of moment when you're given a diagnosis and suddenly your life is divided into 2, life before the brain tumor and life after. And that's true for the person who's ill as it is for you as a caregiver. And that's important because I found myself in uncharted territory when my husband fell ill. I had new circumstances to deal with that I truly had no preparation for. Nothing in my life really gave me scaffolding to understand where I would be headed. And I felt in some ways like my life was sort of ripped apart, and I'd been planted on Mars in this foreign land with all these responsibilities where everything was so different and so hard all the time. And human beings, I think, are wired to cope with adversity in different ways. And some of us go into shock and wonder how this can be happening. Some of us hurl ourselves into all the logistics and planning. Who's going to look after my kids? How are we going to manage meals? Who's going to carpool for my son's baseball team? Can we cancel Christmas? All of that becomes extremely overwhelming, and dismay settles in, and that grind takes over, and we get worn down because suddenly we've been asked to climb Mount Everest, and it is hard. It is very hard. And what I can tell you is, from my limited knowledge, this is all normal. So in our story at the beginning, there were many new strategies that we had to deploy. Harold took medication every day. He had many appointments for scans and blood work and meetings, as I'm sure you're all familiar with, as well as rehab. His tumor affected a lot of his cognitive abilities. His brain tumor caused seizures. He could no longer drive. And routine things like using a cell phone, a laptop, even the remote control on the TV were very hard and taxed him greatly, so he needed constant help. I watched him like a hawk, and I would dictate notes into my cell phone of things to ask the doctor. And I had spreadsheets with all our appointments and a big calendar in the kitchen logging all the details of our lives, and I felt like I was sort of a planning maniac. And each night I would go to bed exhausted, and I would wake up at dawn before anybody else in the house so that I could catch up, whether it was on laundry or emails or housework. And I think the hardest part about caring for somebody with a brain tumor is that you are not likely caring very well for yourself. And in our haste to fight, the good fight, which we do, and to survive, that sense of self, that question of how am I doing? What do I need? That can get lost really easily. So I want to talk about change. Change is hard. I'm sure some of the things I've described are familiar to you. Viktor Frankl famously wrote, "When we're no longer able to change a situation, we're challenged to change ourselves." Harold was very scared of his illness, with good reason. We were very close in our marriage, and we talked a lot about his experience after his diagnosis. He was brave, but his life had really changed. He couldn't throw a baseball with his son anymore. He couldn't be the person that he had been at work. A lifelong reader and writer and a lover of books, he could no longer make sense of the printed page. So he changed. And that change impacted all of us as a family, and his friends and his neighbors and his colleagues. Some of the other ways in which patients are challenged by change is appetite, sleep, mobility, exercise, the sense of humor, personality, energy levels, patience, communication. All of these things can suddenly be quite different. Routines also changed. There were things that my husband needed that meant that our family had to conform. My kids didn't have a dad to help them with math homework anymore. My younger son, who had always enjoyed reading with my husband at bedtime, couldn't be read to anymore. So we had to find new ways of connecting and new ways of operating in our home. Finances also change dramatically. As many of you may know, there are costs associated with serious illness, including many cancers. When I was sick, I needed an injection after every chemotherapy appointment that cost thousands of dollars, and it was not covered by OHIP or by our family health insurance. Harold required physical and occupational therapy as well as the care of a psychiatrist. So the impacts of a lot of supports challenge families financially. So what does one do in a vortex of change and challenge? Neuroscientists tell us that our brains, our ancient reptilian brains, respond to danger with what's called a fight or flight response. This is our first defense against fear. So I want to spend a moment talking about fear, because fears are very real when you're a caregiver of a person who's seriously sick. I was very afraid a lot of the time, although I masked that very well, I think. And I tried to shield my husband, truthfully, from a lot of my own fears. My two experiences of fear, apart from that it happened every day or seemed to be very pervasive, was that I wanted to forget everything and run away. And that's FEAR. This is how I used to think about it. Or I wanted to face everything and rise. I wanted to fight and really strive to preserve and protect my husband. So for Harold and I, and I'm sure this might be similar for others, you sort of live from MRI to MRI, from scan to scan. If you have a few days before your next scan, you're nervous and anxious and you don't sleep, and then when you hear those words stable or intact or no change, those wonderful words, you're thrilled and you sort of let the air out a little bit. And in the meantime, you're sort of tracking the things that you're worried about and you're fearful of. So I was afraid that I wasn't doing everything for my husband. I was afraid I was ignoring my kids. Sometimes I was afraid of not working hard enough at my job, my real job, my job at work job. I was afraid people would ask me the worst question of all. I wonder if you know what that is. How are you? The worst question. Because you never know what to say. And every day it's a hard question. I was afraid of not being strong enough for my other family members. And I was afraid of failure. I was afraid of death. And caregiving is very exhausting. So fear and exhaustion, I think, are two sort of experiences that are universal. And caregiving is exhausting. And fear is a large part of that. You're walking around with this weight. And that's why self-care is so important. I remember once at one of my husband's appointments that I had developed calluses on my hand from clenching my fist so hard because I was sort of always nervous and anxious. And I also remember once trying to support Harold walking. He sort of stumbled and lost his balance and fell, and I pulled about a muscle in my back, and I was hurt for quite a while, and I never went to the doctor and never sort of sought proper care for it because I was just pushing through. So there's physical exhaustion, and then there's emotional exhaustion too. I lived in a house where people came and went, and I didn't have a lot of privacy. When I closed the bathroom door sometimes to take my shower, I cried because that was a place where I could let go of some of that emotion. And so I think when you're caring for someone who's sick, you're always trying to present your best self. And your best self is sometimes not what you see when you look in the bathroom mirror. So I think a really important question that I learned is, what is your mindset? And I kind of call that the running soundtrack in your head. What's that voice telling you as you move through? I wish I had a silver bullet for you to tell you that I could give you something that would ease your mind and calm it, or ease your finances or your fatigue. But I did learn a few things. And one of them was that, when Harold was sick, I didn't feel I could change his reality. I could comfort him and I could make things easier for him, but I couldn't change the reality of the fact of having a brain tumor. But I could choose the mindset with which I approached each day. And I called that mindset the running soundtrack in your head. And the reason I think this is important is because if you change your thoughts, you can change your mood. And if you change your mood, you can change your behavior. And if you change your behavior, maybe you might change the trajectory of your day a little bit. So one of the things that we did when Harold's finished his radiation treatment is we signed up for a meditation course offered by Wellspring. And it's called The Healing Journey. I don't know if any of you have heard of it or taken it before, but it was amazing for us. And it really teaches you about being present and being mindful. And that's very important, I think, because we spend so much time as caregivers anticipating needs and meeting needs and thinking about the lists of the things that we need to do and worrying about tomorrow. And what the course taught was that if we could make the day the best day in that moment, it could make a huge difference. So that here and now mindset is one of my pieces of advice. If you can stay focused on that, it can actually be very helpful. But with that, I wanted to speak about things I think are most important, what you might need most as a caregiver, even if you don't know it. And there's 6 things, and they're fairly self-evident in some ways. And I guess when I was telling Rosie, as I was preparing these remarks, these would be the things I would tell myself if I could wind the tape back and go back to where I was. And I think of them as life preservers. So I'm going to go through them. Number 1, and you'll find it odd that maybe it's at the top of the list, but is forgiveness. Forgive yourself for not being perfect. That's hard because you're trying so hard to be perfect. Forgive yourself for messing up sometimes or not being as loving or patient or kind as you want to be. Forgive the people who don't show up for you or for your loved one the way you hope that they might. Forgive the doctors and nurses who infuriate you sometimes or let you down. Forgiveness is key. It's okay to be angry, I believe, but you can't carry that anger around with you. Number 2, respite, or what I call taking a break. You know, when you're on a plane, they tell you to put the oxygen mask on the person, on yourself first before you put it on the person you're looking after, your child. It's a great metaphor for self-care, because I don't think that it's possible as a caregiver to survive this process if you don't take a break from time to time. You may not want to. I found it very hard. People would say, you know, come out, go for a walk with me. Initially, I found that the hardest thing to do. I wanted to be by my husband's side all the time. But you have to do that. You have to take a nap, take a walk, have a cup of tea, go to the gym, whatever it is. You need to take a break every day. And number 3, staying in the present. That goes back to that idea of mindfulness, but really, if you think about it, the present is all that we can deal with in our life. The day that we're in is the only day we can truly know. Caregiver brains don't accept this fact easily. We're mentally tallying up those to-do items and trying to make things better, thinking forward all the time. So I tried very hard when Harold was sick to stay in the moment and to approach each day as its own discrete opportunity to succeed and not jump ahead. Number 4, so important, help. I will confess that I am not the sort of person who is very comfortable asking for help. I am the oldest of 3 children, and I have always been, my friends and family will tell you, a very capable and self-sufficient person. And so asking for help is very hard for me, but I had to learn. I truly did. So what did I do? I let people organize a dinner schedule when my husband was in treatment and it was hard to prepare meals. I allowed a friend to carpool my kids to baseball and basketball. When I returned to work, I had a volunteer driving schedule for my husband to take him to his appointments when I could not. Things like that. And it was life-altering. And one of the secrets that I learned is actually people are so desperate to help you. They so much want that experience. They just don't know what to do. And they'll say, let me know if you need anything. And you have to tell them. Number 5, and I find this is sort of funny that I'm putting positivity down, like who would want to be negative in a situation like this? And it seems so obvious, but it's not. By the middle of Harold's tumor journey, things were unraveling for our family on many fronts. My oldest son was struggling in school. Harold's employer was denying him employee benefits, which was causing us to retain legal counsel and consider a lawsuit. Harold himself was quite depressed and withdrawn after months of being sick, and I was exhausted. So how do you stay positive when that is your reality? And yet, what I have learned is that positivity matters. Even in the smallest ways, it generates strength and vitality, and it even can save your sanity. So like a muscle that you have to use, I do believe that starting a practice of thinking of things that you can be grateful for and things that count as blessings can be extraordinarily beneficial. It's hard, but it's important to try to do that. And number 6, and the last, is attending to spirit. This may not seem like it's as important as the other things I've described, but I've learned that for many people, including myself, spiritual matters can become very, very important when times are tough in life. There's actually clinical research showing that patients in hospitals report better outcomes in terms of satisfaction with care when their spiritual matters are addressed. And this makes great sense to me So I would say don't be surprised if your mind wanders to that territory as you are caring for your loved one, wondering about the meaning of suffering or how to cope with loss. These are real questions that need real answers, and doctors and nurses do not have these conversations with you. So you have to find a way to introduce some exploration of what spirituality means for you in your life. Harold and I committed to a practice of meditation, and that was what worked for us. And I recommend it, but it may not be for everybody. Some people talk about exposure to nature, the sort of therapeutic value of being in nature. In Japan, they actually have a practice, I think, called forest bathing, where you go into the woods, and it's intended to act as a balm when you're under stress. And I think that nature does have its own beauty. But whatever you can do, whether it's walking in the woods or lighting candles or practicing your faith tradition if you have one, reading sacred texts, whatever that is, I think that's so important to pursue. There's a writer who I used to read when Harold couldn't read, and I would read to him. We would read together, a writer, an American writer whose name is Annie Lamott. And she's very prolific on this topic. And she says this line, "We are not human beings having a spiritual life. We are spiritual beings having a human life." So I would say pay attention to your body and ask for help when you need it, and look after yourself, but also look after your soul and your spirit, because it will help you. Paying attention to your spirit and the spirituality in your life, and you will find strength that you didn't know you had. That's all I have to say. That's my story. Thank you so much for listening.
I just want to point out, Suzanne and I put together a list of some helpful resources, many of which Suzanne used personally.